Shalom and welcome to the video for chapters 11 and 12, the imperfect, as you can see here on the screen. Let me just enlarge the window there and we'll get started. Here are the focus questions for today. There are four things. First, what is the imperfect tense? And we use tense in quotations. And how do I translate it when I come across one of them? And maybe most importantly, how do I recognize it? And as part of that question, we'll want to know, how does the imperfect relate to the perfect, both in terms of what it means and also in terms of how it's going to look on the page when we're looking through the Hebrew Bible. And then fourthly, what are drop letter imperfects? You know, I've told you in the past that you should never, ever trust language teachers who say always, right? Because languages are notorious for breaking the rules that we need to learn in order to read them. And Hebrew is, of course, no different. So we're going to learn, first of all, the rules related to the regular imperfects, that is, the way that imperfects typically act, but then we're also going to learn a couple of things related to irregular imperfects, or imperfects that we'll find that don't seem to follow the rules exactly. So those are the four focus questions for today. Let's jump right in. First, how are perfect verbs different from imperfect verbs? Let's start with what we know. We've been working with the perfect verbs for weeks now, parsing them, translating them, and so now that we have that firm base of knowledge, let's compare what we know about the perfects to the imperfects. Let's begin on the level of meaning. A perfect verb, we've learned, typically refers to completed action. So we can often use, for instance, the English past tense to translate a perfect verb. He guarded, the king killed, the queen ruled, something like this, or Abraham walked toward Egypt. Those are all ways of talking about past events, and the perfect tense can be used in this way. Now, the imperfect is a little bit different. It is typically refers to incomplete action, which can be translated in English in a number of ways. Typically, we can talk about it in terms of the future, English future tense. He will guard. Abraham will go toward Egypt. These are actions that have not already been done. They are incomplete, imperfect. Not fully actualized yet. So that's a general way of distinguishing between these two. Of course, there are more complex ways of talking about them, but for now, let's enter into the imperfect verbs with this very a kind of simple distinction between perfect as completed action and imperfect as incomplete action. So let's now turn to morphology. And what I mean by that is when we look at a perfect and an imperfect verb, based on the things that are added to those verbs to inflect them, how do they look different? Well, let me give you a very simple rule that I think can be helpful that will help you recognize immediately whether a verb is perfect or imperfect. Perfect verbs always have suffixes. Well, I should say they typically have suffixes, right? The third masculine singular has no suffix, so shamar is just the root, and you know that it's third masculine singular by typically by looking at the comments and the patach. But typically, the perfect is a suffix conjugation. That is, it tells you if I said it, or you said it, or he, she, it said it, or did the action of the verb by adding things to the end. Let's look at three examples. Amadti, right? I've highlighted the suffixes as a way of showing what is added to the end in the perfect. So this is a first common singular, all perfect. From amad, which refers to the action of standing. And so we would translate this as I stood. And we can do that in the past tense here. The second example, shamarnu, is the first common plural. Notice that nu at the end, which is highlighted. That is the suffix that is used in the perfect to indicate that we did something. So first common plural, all perfect, we guarded. And then the last one, shamru, this one sometimes gives us trouble. It's another common, it's a third common plural, all perfect, and this is they guarded. And it can take both a masculine and a feminine subject or a mixed group as well. And so, but the point here is that the perfect conjugation takes suffixes. It has things added to the end of the verbal root in order to inflect them, or in order to make it clear who or what the subject of the verb is. Now let's turn to the right-hand column here that I'm circling to look at the imperfect. Now, how does the imperfect inflect the root in order to tell us what the person and number is? It does it by adding both prefixes and suffixes. Now, let me put it this way. On an imperfect verb, you will always find a prefix. There will always be a prefix here, and this is the case where you can actually trust the language teacher. Imperfect verbs are marked by a prefix, and so let's look at but they also can have suffixes, so it's both. So the imperfect has prefixes and suffixes, whereas the perfect only has suffixes. Let's look at an example. Nishmor. Nishmor. Here, you recognize the root, I'm sure, shamar, and then I have highlighted the prefix, nish, the noon, and the hirik. Now, this is the first common plural, so we will guard is how you would translate this. Notice, just this is an interesting little hint, that both the first common plural in the imperfect and the first common plural in the perfect use the letter noon. So that might be one way to help you remember that when you see the noon in front of the imperfect verb, that you're probably looking at the first common plural. Let's look at the second example, eshmor. Now in this case, the aleph, oops, where's my cursor? The aleph is tagged on to the front as a prefix, and this is the first common singular. The first common singular, this I will guard. Okay, so that's quite different actually from the T. So there's not much here that's going to help us remember from the perfect that will help us remember the imperfect first common singular. So we're just going to have to remember that one, eshmor, first common singular. Yishmeru. Yishmeru. This is example number 3, and here we have an example of an imperfect that has both a prefix and a suffix. The prefix being the yod, and then the suffix being the vav at the end, the shurk at the end. So again, to summarize, perfect has suffixes, imperfect has prefixes. Let's look at the full chart of the imperfects. Take a second just to look at it, familiarize yourself. Remember that the root is marked by the filled-in letter shamar. And so take a moment just to look at those. Okay, so you'll probably notice that I added these little comments or these little glosses here on the side, just so that you can see a little bit more clearly where which one is first person, second person. And just as a review, remember first person is I or we, second person is you or you all, both genders, and third person is he, she, it, or they. They, that's third person. So let's look at these one at a time. We've already looked at a couple of these actually in the previous screen. Eshmor, this is the first common singular. Tishmor, this is the second masculine singular. Now you'll notice, look at that star that I have. It's the same color as the one down here, these two green stars. Now the reason I signaled those two, or the reason I flagged those two for comment, is because if you notice, they are morphologically identical. They look the same. They're both Tishmor. But both of them, both can mean, or this single form Tishmor can mean both you, masculine, so second person masculine singular, and third person feminine singular. So if you're going to determine precisely what the subject of the verb will be, you'll simply have to look at the context and determine it from there, and that should be relatively easy to do. Okay, let's look here at the second feminine singular, tishmeri. Tishmeri. You, feminine singular, will guard. Yishmor, third person masculine singular, he will guard. Of course, this is the form that you'll most often see because the Hebrew Bible is full of men doing things, right? And so you will often see this form with the yod. And remember again, imperfect always has a prefix on it. Notice in all of these verbs, every single one has a prefix attached to it. That is a mark of the imperfect. Some of them have suffixes, a couple of them, most of them have suffixes, a couple of them do not. So here we have, for instance, Eshmor has no suffix, and nishmor has no suffix as well. So you just have to recognize that, and recognize also that the real rule is that the imperfect always has a prefix attached to it. So it will be important to but it will still be important to memorize both, so you can recognize both the forms that have the suffix and the forms that do not have the suffix. So yishmor, he will guard. Tishmor, she will guard. Again, here we see that the third feminine singular is identical in the way that it looks to the second masculine singular. Nishmor, this is a form we've already seen. The noon and the hirik mark the first common plural. Tishmeru, this is the second masculine plural. You will guard, or referring to a group of men or to a mixed group. You all will guard. Tishmorana, this is the second person feminine plural, and what you notice is that here we have yet another form that has the second feminine plural and the third feminine plural look exactly the same, so it's another identical form. And in this case, you will guard feminine plural, so you women, you feminine subjects will guard, and in this case they, referring to a group of feminine subjects, they will guard. So again, context will be key there in determining what the subject is, and in fact how you will translate it. Yishmeru, they will guard. Notice here there's a very close connection between third masculine singular, yishmor, and yishmeru. The only difference really is the fact that you have the u at the end of the plural, which you may remember that the u's, shamru, for instance, is also a plural ending in the prefix conjugation that is in the perfect. So maybe that will help you remember that in the imperfect, the u is also found on the third plural. The only difference being, of course, that the imperfect doesn't have a general common plural. It actually has a masculine and feminine plural here. Yishmeru for the their masculine plural, and tishmorana for the third feminine plural. Okay, so that's your introduction to the imperfect, and I highly suggest this week that you take a lot of time to go over and memorize this chart. Again, you can use this shamar as a paradigm verb, but make sure you get these endings down. Just like the perfect, it's so important that you get these ingrained in your head so that it becomes second nature. So let's do some practice now. Now that you've seen the chart, let's look at a few things. Yimloch, right here. This is the first one. Let's begin with what we know. You probably recognize mem lamed kaf, right? Mem lamed kaf. This is the malach. This is the word malach. Now, you know now from the imperfect chart we were just looking at that the imperfect verbs have prefixes, and you may recognize this yod and hirik. So you recognize the root malach, and then you have to figure out, well, what does that yod refer to? Let's go back to our chart and see if you can figure it out. Not first common singular, that's an aleph. Not second, that has tavs. Oh, the third. Both of the third masculines have yods, so we're probably looking at a masculine subject. Now we have to then ask, is there any ending? Is there an u at the end that would tell us this is third masculine plural? Yimloch, no, this is third masculine singular. And so, he will rule. Third masculine singular, pa'al imperfect. Very good job if you're able to recognize that. If not, that's okay. We just looked at the chart for the first time. Just make sure you go back and that you memorize each of these prefixes. Okay, so let's look at the next one. Nimtza, nimtza. So here you might recognize the root, right? Go with what's familiar first and then try and figure out the stuff that you don't get immediately. Matzah, you may remember, refers to finding something, and then that leaves you with this noon prefix. Do you remember what the noon prefix refers to? You might remember that there is a form of the perfect which uses a noon, and that's very similar to the form used in the imperfect. So let's go back to our chart. Ah, here it is. The noon marks the first common plural. And you may remember that in the perfect, um, new, the ending new is what marks the first common plural in the perfect. So the noon there helps us to see that this is first plural. So, nimca, first common plural, pa'al, imperfect. I'm sorry, this is not we will rule. Typo there. We will find. There we go. So we will find first common plural, pa'al, imperfect, from the root matzah. Let's look at the next one. Tishmeru, tishmeru. Well, what do you notice that is familiar here? You might notice the shamar, the root shin mem resh. You probably recognize this as the word for guard. And so that would mean that these two letters on the back end and on the front, the prefix and the suffix here, those are imperfect markers. Those are signal letters. So let's look back at our chart and see if we can figure out what those letters are telling us. Well, we have a lot of different forms with the letter tav in the front. We have here the second masculine plural, here the second feminine plural, and here, the second feminine plural and the second feminine singular, and here the third feminine singular and the third feminine plural. So which one is it? Let's go back to our chart. Tishmeru. So it begins with a tav and ends with a shurek. Let's find that one. Okay, begins with the tav, no ending. It can't be this one. Begins with the tav, no, well, it has an ending, but it's hirak yod, so that's not going to help us. That one doesn't have a tav. This one has a tav prefix. That's not going to help us. There's no ending there. This one, oh, look at this one. This one begins with the tav, it ends with the shurek, and that's exactly the form we're looking for. So second, let's look at this again, second masculine plural, pa'al imperfect. You masculine plural, will guard, second masculine plural, pa'al imperfect. Again, the markers, the signal letters are the tav and the shurek at the end. And then let's look at the last one, yishme'u. So what do you recognize that is familiar? Well, shin mem ayin is the verbal root referring to the action of hearing something, right? So let's look at the prefixes and the suffixes and see if we can figure out how to translate this. First prefix is a yod, or the prefix is a yod, and then the suffix is the shurek, right? The vav with the dot in the middle of it, which makes the oo sound. Let's look back at our chart. What has a yod and the oo sound, the shurek, at the end of the verbal form? Let's start from the beginning. Can't be this one, it has an aleph. Can't be second masculine singular, that has a tav. Can't be second feminine singular, that has a tav and a yod. Well, this looks like it could be promising. It has a yod on the front. The only problem is it doesn't have the oo at the end. The third feminine singular has the tav at the front, no ending. That's not going to help us. First common plural, noon, no, that's not going to help us. Second masculine plural, tav, again, no money. Tav, no money. Oh, here's one. The yod and the shurek, both. What the yod at the beginning, the shurek at the end. And that's exactly what we have. So we have here the third masculine plural. Let's go down. Third masculine plural, pa'al imperfect, they will hear. Okay, from Shama. Good, let's do just a couple more practices, see if you can figure this one out. Tikra, tikra. Okay, verbal form is kara, the verbal root is kara, and we have the tav as just the tav as a prefix. Now you may remember that the tav is one of those tricky ones. This is one of the forms that has a star next to it. So let's look at those here. Remember, the form that has the tav only in front can be either a second masculine singular or it can be a third person feminine singular. So we have to let context help us. In this case, you actually don't have a context, so it could be you, second masculine singular, or she, third feminine singular, will call or proclaim. So we parse it as second masculine singular, pa'al imperfect, or third person feminine singular Pa'al imperfect. If we were looking at this in the context of a sentence, it would be a little bit easier to determine which of the two this verb actually is. Let's look at the next one. Tishma'i, again, tav prefix, but then a hirak yod ending. So let's go back to our chart. Tav prefix, so it's either this one, or one of these, and a hirak yod ending. Well, the only one that has a hirak yod ending is here, tishmeri. You will, in this case, you will guard. So second person feminine singular. Let's see, let's look at our example. You, feminine singular, will hear. So this is a second feminine singular, Pa'al, imperfect. The two markers are the tav and the hirak yod at the end. And then finally, tishmorana. Tishmorana. You, feminine plural, they will guard. The markers here being the tav and the noon and the hey, the noon comets hey at the end. So let's look again at the chart. This is actually the exact letter. And notice that forms with the tav and the noon comets hey at the end can be either second person feminine plural or third person feminine plural. So again, it's ambiguous, and you're going to have to allow the context to help you determine how exactly to translate it. So you'll notice I have here you, feminine plural, so you, feminine subjects, will guard, or they, feminine plural, will guard. So this is the second person feminine plural, Pa'al imperfect, or the third person feminine plural, Pa'al imperfect. Wow, that's a lot of information. Let's just take a pause there for a second to let me get a drink, and also to let you just take a moment to breathe. There's a lot of information there, to be sure. I highly encourage you, get started on this as soon as possible. This once you get the perfect endings down and the imperfect endings down, you will have you will have all of the prefixes and suffixes that you need in order to interpret and translate imperfect and perfect verbs. So this is very, very important to memorize these elements that tell us the gender and number and person of the subject. Very, very important. So take a breather now for just a second, and then we're going to move on to the drop letter imperfects. So the verbs that I've shown you now are regular verbs. There aren't any kind of funny anomalies happening here. They are regular verbs. Now we're going to look at some that don't follow the rules perfectly, but I'm going to help you through it a little bit and give you a little bit of a process that will help you determine, you know, what the root of the verb is, and it will help you ultimately to translate the verb, which is what we're really after. So drop letter imperfects. Three things to say. Not all imperfect verbs are regular. I just said that. In fact, many verbs in the Hebrew Bible Old Testament are irregular. And when I say many, I really mean many. You really cannot read the Hebrew Bible if you don't understand how to recognize these drop letter imperfects. So here's the idea. Verbs that begin, that is, have as their first radical in the root, the first letter in the root, verbs that begin with yod, vav, nun, lamed, and hey can lose or drop their first letter in the imperfect. That's the basic thing we're going to focus on, is examples in which roots that have one of these letters in their in the first position in the root, they lose it in the imperfect. And so what we have to do is learn what happens when they lose it, what the verb looks like, and then how to recover what the original root is so that we can provide a proper translation. So fear not. I have created 4 steps to salvation. Yes, you can ascend the ontological ladder of verbal conjugations, and I'm going to show you how to do it today. 4 steps. Here's the first one. Here is your irregular imperfect verb. What do you do? The first step is that you need to freak out and say, I don't know what that is. I don't recognize it. There might be a couple things that look familiar to me, but by and large, I have no idea what this drop letter, what this word is at all. You might recognize the aleph, right? That it is typically used as a first common singular imperfect and imperfect verbs, but by and large, you just think, I don't know what to do. So step one is that you need to freak out and say things like OMG and oh God, why have you forsaken me? And save me, sweet Jesus, which is what this whole process is all about, right? Step number two, remember your baptism. You have to find firm ground to stand on if you're going to parse properly these verbs. And then now steps 3 and 4, these are the real steps. First, look for the imperfect signal letters. That is, look for those prefixes and suffixes that we were just reviewing. And for your convenience, I've put the chart here. So the first thing you need to do, if you come across a verb and you say, I have no idea what that is, it looks like it's probably even missing a letter, first thing to do is look for the imperfect signal letters. Is there anything you see that could potentially be one of these prefixes? And so you go down the list and you think, okay, well, look at this first verb. This is the verb that I've been showing you over the ekach, the verb I've been showing you over these past few slides. Well, there is in fact a signal letter, and that is the aleph here. So that's the first thing you do. Look for the signal letters. That is the prefixes and the suffixes, all of which the prefixes and suffixes are highlighted here. And see, after you've identified those, see if the last two letters of the word, or the two remaining, I should say, if the two remaining letters, after you've identified the prefixes, are from a root that you know. And so let's see if you can figure out what this root might be. You know the aleph is an imperfect. Now remember back to the first step. Verbs that begin with yod, vav, nun, lamed, and hey often lose their first letter. So do you know any words that begin with one of those 5 letters, yod, vav, nun, lamed, or hey, that also end with kof and chet? Can you think of one? So just try it one at a time. Just try and plug in those. Yod, Vav, Nud, Lam, and Hey. Do I know any of the, is there a Hakach? Well, no, a Vakach. No, a Nakach. We don't know any of those. What about a Lakach? Oh, that is actually a root that you know. It is the letter from which we get the word for take, right? Lakach means to take. And so you go through those 4 steps, your first 2 steps, the freak out, remember your baptism, and then thirdly, look for the imperfect signal letters and see if the remaining letters are the last 2 letters of a root that you know. So all of these drop letter imperfect examples are from Lakach. And the last 2 letters of that root are remaining. The first letter has been replaced by the prefix of the imperfect. Okay, so you can go through these examples on your own. All of these come from Lakach. Let's look at a few other examples that are not from Lakach. Yeah, so there we go. See, the root is Lakach. And so you can see no lamed, but all we have is the kof and the chet left over. Okay, a couple drop letter imperfect, some practice examples. Nelech, nelech, that's the first one. So go through the steps. Freak out. Oh my gosh, what is that? I don't know what it is. Remember your baptism. Jesus is for you, right? Jesus wants you to do well in Hebrew. Third step, you need to see if you can identify any of the imperfect prefixes. So the first you might recognize it. The noon, right? You might remember, oh, I remember back from the lecture, noon is one of the prefixes on the imperfect. So then the fourth step is you have to look at the last 2 letters. Okay. Lamed and Kaf. Do you know any roots, any verbal roots that end with Lamed and Kaf and that begin with one of these 3? Whoops. Yod, Vav, Nun, Lamed, or Hey. Can you remember? Halach, the word for referring to walking. So this is a first common plural, pa'al, imperfect. The nun, of course, is the prefix on the first common plural, imperfect. So we will walk. Let's look at the next one. Teshev. Shave. Okay, go through the process, freak out, remember your baptism, and then look for prefixes. Is tav ever used as a prefix in the imperfect? You bet it is. And if you actually want to, see that chart, just open up to chapter 11 of your book. If you want to follow along here and just compare your own chart to the chart in your book to what you're looking at here, you can find it on page 95. So teshav. Well, there are quite a few, actually, quite a few verbs that begin with a tav, right? So you'll have to go back to your chart and figure out which ones begin with a tav. Well, the second masculine singular does, the second feminine singular does, and then the third feminine singular begins with a tav. The second masculine plural begins at the tav. The second feminine plural begins at the tav. The third feminine plural begins at the tav. A lot of them begin with tav. So what we need to do is then use the suffix to really figure out where we're at. And you may, check this out, there is no suffix, right? So we have to find the form of the imperfect that begins with the tav and has no suffix. And that would be second feminine singular and second masculine singular and third feminine singular. So remember, that's an ambiguous form, so we would have to look at the context to determine it. So this one would be second masculine singular or third feminine singular, all imperfect, from yashav. So the root here, the yod, has fallen off. Yashav, which refers to sitting or dwelling. So either you will dwell or sit, or she will sit or dwell. Again, the remaining letters are sheen and bait, and the yod has dropped off and been replaced by the tav. Okay. Third and final example, yeda, yeda. Now this is kind of a little bit of a tricky one. Well, let me give you just a second to look at it. Oh, I've already given you the answer. Uh-oh, you got the a little cheater answer there. Now, this is the third so I'll just talk from the answer and explain it from here. This is the third masculine singular, all imperfect, from yada, yod, dalet, ayin. Now, what's a little bit horrible and terrible for us about this one is that the prefix is the same as the root, right? Yod. This is the third masculine singular, and remember, back to the chart, the third masculine singular has a yod here, but that is also the first letter of the root, right? Yod, dalet, ayin. So this is a little bit tricky. So as you might ask the question, well, how do I tell the difference between yeda, which is a third masculine singular imperfect, and in which the yod has dropped off, from the third masculine singular of the perfect, which I've put down here, yada? How do you tell? Well, the difference, this is where you have to look at the vowels very carefully. And that's where the only difference is in the first vowel, right? The komets or the tsere. That's the only difference, because again, the suffix yod is the same as the first letter of the root yod. So just watch out for words like that, and you may have to ultimately have to check your dictionary just to make sure that you're parsing it correctly. But this would be he will know in the imperfect, he will know, whereas the perfect would be he knew, something like that. Let's wrap it up now. Focus this week on learning the imperfect signal letters. This is crucial if you're going to be able to read effectively and accurately the Hebrew Bible. Learn those prefixes and suffixes. Remember the differences and the similarities between the perfect and the imperfect. The perfect has only suffixes. The imperfect always has prefixes and sometimes has suffixes. Secondly, practice recognizing the root in drop letter imperfects. There are a number of exercises in your book that will allow you to practice this. So practice recognizing the root. This will also give you an opportunity to practice your vocabulary, right? Especially the vocabulary, the verbal roots that are in your vocab lists. So this is a good opportunity to review the verbal roots that you already know. And then thirdly, just keep reviewing your vocabulary. We just had a comprehensive exam that involved a list of your vocabulary words. Keep reviewing those, and especially the verbs, because you're only going to need them more as we move into the imperfect verb and learning in particular about the drop letter imperfects, which really require you to have a pretty strong grasp of the verbal roots. Let's conclude there. Thank you for joining this video and for watching this video, and I look forward to talking with you this week.